I sit at my kitchen table, the same one where I used to help my son with his spelling tests, the wood worn smooth by years of love and spills. My name is Julie, and I'm 67 years old. The clock on the wall ticks too loudly today each second, a reminder of the emptiness that settled into my bones. It was last April when my son Michael stood right here in this room and said, "Mom, it's time for you to go. This house isn't yours anymore." His voice was steady, like he was reading from a script, but his words cut deeper than any knife. Behind him, his wife Sarah stood with her arms folded, her eyes fixed on the floor. She didn't look at me. She never really did. I raised Michael on my own after my husband Tom died when Michael was 8. Tom collapsed one autumn evening, his heart giving out before I could say goodbye. I buried my sorrow in the work of keeping our little family whole. I was a bookkeeper, then balancing ledgers for a small accounting firm, my fingers stained with ink as I calculated other people's futures. At night, I'd come home to make meatloaf, check Michael's homework, and read him stories about pirates and dragon stories Tom used to tell. I stretched every dollar, mended Michael's torn jackets, and skipped my own doctor's visits to afford his school supplies. When Michael got into college, I sold Tom's old pickup truck to help with tuition. When he married Sarah, I emptied my savings for their wedding, smiling through the quiet ache of an empty nest. I thought love meant giving everything. I thought it would hold us together. But that day in the kitchen, Michael's words shattered that illusion. This house, my house, the one Tom and I bought with our hopes and every spare penny, was now theirs. They needed space. Michael said, his eyes skimming past mine, space for their daughters, my granddaughters Lily and Grace, who'd climb into my lap and call me Nana with giggles that warmed my heart, space for Sarah's yoga studio dreams, for Michael's startup that was always about to take off. I was just extra. "You're retired, Mom." Michael said, his tone clipped. "You don't need a big house. Sarah found a senior community. It's practical. As if my life could be boxed up and stored away like old furniture. I wanted to shout to remind him of the nights I stayed up sewing his baseball uniform, the years I wore the same coat so he could have new sneakers. But my throat tightened, and all I could do was nod. Sarah slid a brochure across the table. Silver Pines Retirement Village, with photos of gray-haired strangers smiling over chessboards. I stared at it, my hands shaking, and felt something inside me splinter. Not shatter, not yet, but splinter like a crack in the china teacup Tom gave me on our first anniversary. The weeks after that were a fog of silence. Michael and Sarah stopped calling. No more invitations to Sunday dinners where I'd spend hours roasting chicken while Sarah scrolled through her phone. I used to babysit Lily and Grace for free, picking them up from preschool, tying their shoelaces, singing them the lullabies I once sang to Michael. I thought I was weaving a family thread by thread, but to them I was just a service like a maid or a nanny they didn't have to pay. When Michael's startup needed cash, I sold some of my stock shares Tom had invested in years ago, our safety net, for a retirement we'd planned together. I handed over the money without a second thought. It's for the girls, I told myself, for their dreams. Then came the moment that broke me. It was a Wednesday, and I'd driven to their house to drop off a scarf I'd knitted for Grace's 4th birthday, soft blue wool with tiny stars stitched into the ends. I knocked, but no one answered. Through the window, I saw them, Michael, Sarah, the girls, and Sarah's parents, gathered around a table with a birthday cake. Grace's cake. Balloons floated above them, and laughter spilled out bright and sharp. I stood there, the scarf in my hands, my heart thudding. Sarah's mother opened the door, her smile fading when she saw me. "Oh, Julie," she said, her voice thick with pity. "We weren't expecting you." Michael appeared, his face tight. "Mom, it's not a good time," he said. "You should have called." I clutched the scarf, my eyes burning, and realized I hadn't been invited to my own granddaughter's birthday. I drove home with the scarf on the seat beside me, its stars blurring through my tears. That night, I sat in my living room surrounded by photos, Michael's first bike ride, our camping trips. Tom's grin captured in faded Polaroids. I felt like a shadow fading from my own story. Sarah's mother's pitying look echoed in my mind. "You're just a lonely old woman." She didn't say it, but her eyes did. And Michael's dismissal sealed it. I didn't sleep that night. I walked out to the backyard where Tom and I used to sit under the maple tree planning our future over glasses of iced tea. The tree stood tall, its leaves whispering in the spring breeze. But Tom was gone, and now Michael was too. I touched the trunk, its bark rough under my fingers, and whispered, "What do I do, Tom?" The night was silent, but deep inside I felt a spark, small, fragile, but alive. I wasn't ready to vanish. The next morning I brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen table with a notebook. My hands trembled as I wrote down every sacrifice, every dollar, every hour, every piece of myself I'd given to Michael and Sarah. The stock shares, the babysitting, the wedding, the house. I hadn't just given them my love, I'd given them my strength, my security, and they'd taken it without gratitude, without care. I closed the notebook and stared out the window at the dawn. The splinter in me was growing, but beneath it something new stirred resolve, quiet but fierce. I started small, like a seed pushing through soil. I called the local community center and joined a painting class, something I hadn't done since high school, when Tom would tease me about my smudged canvases. The first class was clumsy, my brushstrokes were shaky, and I felt out of place among strangers. But a woman named Margaret with silver hair and a warm laugh leaned over and said, "You've got a good eye, Julie. Keep going." Her kindness cracked something open in me, and I went back. Margaret became my friend, the first I'd made in years. Through her, I met other women, widows, mothers, grandmothers who'd also been pushed to the edges of their families, their lives reduced to old or useless. We shared stories over coffee, not just about art, but about loss, about being unseen. They saw me. And slowly, I began to see myself. I stopped calling Michael, not out of anger, but because I couldn't bear his indifference. The girls' drawings stopped arriving, and Sarah's texts, always brusque, always about babysitting, faded away. I missed Lily and Grace so much it hurt to breathe, but I couldn't keep chasing their love. Instead, I turned to my garden where Tom and I used to plant tulips every spring. I dug into the earth, planting lavender and daisies, their colors, a quiet rebellion against the grayness in my heart. Each flower felt like a promise to myself, to Tom, to the woman I was remembering how to be. Then came the letter. It was from Michael, but it wasn't what I'd dreamed of. No warmth, no regret, just a typed note on his startup's letterhead asking for more money. The business was in a rough patch, he wrote, and he knew I had more shares. No mention of the girls, no question about how I was. Just a cold. "Your support would mean a lot." I read it twice. My hand steady, now the splinter in me, no longer just a crack, but a rift. I set the letter down and walked to my desk where I kept my financial papers. I opened the folder with the stock shares, the ones Tom had chosen so carefully for our future, and I made a choice. I wasn't going to be their safety net anymore. I wasn't going to be their babysitter, their burden, their lonely old woman. I was Julie, and I was done. The days after I read Michael's letter felt like waking from a long, heavy sleep. I'd spent so many years pouring myself into him, into Sarah, into the girls, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand still and listen to my own heart. I was 67, and the world had started to see me as a relic, someone to be managed, moved aside, or pitied. But that letter, with its cold formality, lit something in me. Not rage, not yet, but a quiet insistence that I was more than the sum of what I'd given away. I folded it neatly and tucked it into the drawer with my stock papers, promising myself I'd deal with it later. For now, I needed to remember who Julie was. I started spending more time at the community center where the painting class became my sanctuary. Margaret, with her quick wit, and stories of her own grown children who rarely called was a lifeline. We'd sit side by side, our canvases filled with clumsy strokes of color, and talk about everything: her late husband's love for jazz, my memories of Tom teaching Michael how to fish. The other women in the class, all around my age, carried their own wounds. There was Linda, whose daughter had moved across the country and stopped inviting her for holidays, and Rose, who'd been a nurse for 40 years, only to be told by her son she was too old to keep up. We didn't just paint. We shared the kind of truths you only tell when you've lived long enough to know life isn't fair. They became my mirror, reflecting back a woman I'd almost forgotten, someone capable, someone whole. One afternoon as we cleaned our brushes, Margaret nudged me and said, "Julie, you should show your work at the spring art fair. That seascape you did last week, it's got soul." I laughed, brushing it off. My paintings were messy, nothing like the polished pieces in galleries, but her words stuck like a pebble in my shoe. That night, I stood in my spare room where I'd set up a small easel and looked at the seascape, a stormy ocean all blues and grays, with a single lighthouse standing firm. It reminded me of Tom, of the way he'd always been my anchor. I wondered if I could be that for myself now. I didn't call Michael or Sarah, though the silence from them gnawed at me. I miss Lily and Grace so fiercely that sometimes I'd wake up at night, my chest tight, imagining their small hands in mine. But I couldn't go back to being their convenience, their afterthought. Instead, I poured that love into my garden. The lavender and daisies were thriving, and I added a row of sunflowers, their bright faces turning toward the light. Each morning, I'd walk outside with my coffee, touching their petals, feeling a flicker of pride. I was growing something even if my family didn't see it. Then one Saturday, I ran into Clara, an old friend from my bookkeeping days at the grocery store. She was 70 now, her hair a soft white, but her eyes still sparkled with the mischief I remembered. We'd lost touch after Tom died, but standing there by the canned soups, it was like no time had passed. "Julie, you look tired," she said bluntly, then softened. "But you've got that fire in you still. Come over for tea tomorrow." I hesitated, but something in her voice made me say yes. Clara's house was small and cluttered, filled with books and photos of her travels. Over chamomile tea, I told her everything: Michael's words, Sarah's coldness, the birthday. I wasn't invited to the letter. She listened without interrupting, her hands wrapped around her mug. When I finished, she leaned back and said, "They've forgotten who you are, Julie, but you haven't. You're not just their mother or grandmother. You're you." Her words hit me like a wave, and for the first time in months, I cried not out of sadness, but relief. Someone saw me not as a burden or a role, but as Julie. Clara didn't let me wallow. She dragged me to a local history lecture the next week, then a pottery workshop where we laughed like schoolgirls as our clay collapsed. She introduced me to her book club, a group of women who argued about novels and politics with a fierceness that made me feel alive. I started speaking up, sharing my thoughts on Austen and Morrison, my voice growing steadier each time. These women with their own scars and stories reminded me that I wasn't alone. I wasn't the only one who'd been pushed aside, told I was too old or not needed. And I wasn't the only one finding my way back. I began to notice small changes in myself. I stood taller when I walked to the mailbox. I bought a new scarf, bright red, and wore it to the art fair when I finally agreed to show my seascape. Margaret had been relentless, and though I was terrified, I set up my canvas in a corner of the fair expecting no one to care. But people stopped. A young couple bought a small sketch I'd done of my garden. An older man, a retired teacher, told me my lighthouse painting reminded him of his childhood by the coast. I sold 3 pieces that day, and when Margaret hugged me whispering, "I told you so," I felt a warmth I hadn't known in years. It wasn't about the money, it was about being seen. At home, I kept Michael's letter in that drawer unopened since the day it arrived. But its presence was like a shadow reminding me of the choice I'd made. I wasn't ready to respond, not yet. Instead, I called my financial advisor, a kind man named David, who'd worked with Tom years ago. I asked him to review my stock portfolio, the shares I hadn't touched since giving Michael that first chunk of money. David came over with a thick folder and a gentle smile. "Julie," he said, "these shares have grown more than you realize. Tom picked well. You've got options. Options." The word felt foreign, like a language I'd forgotten how to speak. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where Michael had told me to leave, and went through the numbers. The shares were worth far more than I'd thought, enough to secure my future, to keep this house, to live on my terms. I thought about Michael's startup, how he'd taken my money without a thank you, how he'd assumed I'd always be there to bail him out. I thought about Sarah's pitying glances, her mother's dismissive tone. And I thought about Lily and Grace, who I loved more than my own breath, but who were being raised by people who saw me as disposable. "David," I said, my voice calm but firm, "I want to sell the shares. All of them." He raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "What do you want to do with the money?" he asked. I didn't have an answer yet, but I knew it wouldn't go to Michael. Not this time. I asked David to transfer the funds to a new account, one Michael didn't know about. It felt like a secret, a small act of defiance, but it was mine. That night, I walked to the backyard and sat under the maple tree, the air cool against my skin. The sunflowers stood tall, their golden heads glowing in the dusk. I thought of Tom, of the way he'd always believed in me, even when I doubted myself. I thought of the woman I'd been, mother, wife, bookkeeper, giver, and the woman I was becoming. I wasn't sure who she was yet, but she was stronger than I'd realized. The next week, I went to the community center and signed up to teach a beginner's painting class. Me teaching. The idea made me laugh, but Margaret and Clara insisted I had something to share. I started with 5 students, all older women like me, their hands nervous but eager. I showed them how to mix colors, how to let go of perfection. One woman, Helen, painted a shaky rose and cried when she finished, saying it was the first thing she'd made for herself in years. I hugged her, my own eyes wet, and realized I was building something new, not just paintings, but connections, purpose. I still hadn't answered Michael's letter. Part of me wanted to write back to tell him how his words had broken me, how his silence had cut deeper than any insult. But I didn't. Not because I was afraid, but because I was choosing myself. For the first time in decades, I was choosing Julie. The weeks after I sold the stock shares felt like stepping into a new skin, one that fit better, but still pinched in places. I was 67, and for so long I'd been defined by what I gave my time, my money, my heart. Now with that secret bank account holding the money from the shares, I felt a strange freedom, like a bird realizing its cage door had been open all along. But freedom is a heavy thing when you're not used to it, and some nights I'd lie awake wondering if I'd done the right thing. Not for Michael, he'd made his choices, but for Lily and Grace. I loved them so much, it ached, and the thought of them growing up without their Nana's stories or hugs was a grief I carried like a stone. I didn't tell anyone about the money, not even Clara or Margaret. It wasn't about shame. It was about protecting something fragile, something just for me. Instead, I threw myself into the life I was building. The painting class I taught at the community center grew from 5 students to 10, all women with laugh lines and stories etched into their hands. We'd gather in the sunny room with its chipped tables, mixing paints and sharing bits of our lives. Helen, the one who'd cried over her rose, brought me a loaf of homemade bread one day, her way of saying thank you. Another student, Diane, invited me to her granddaughter's piano recital, and I sat in the audience clapping fiercely, feeling like I belonged somewhere again. Margaret and Clara became my anchors. We'd meet for coffee after book club, our conversation stretching into the afternoon. Clara, with her blunt wisdom, kept pushing me to do more. "You've got a spark, Julie," she'd say, her eyes narrowing like she could see straight through me. "Don't let it flicker out." One day she handed me a flyer for a local women's group that helped older women start small businesses or projects. "You should go," she said. "You've got something to say." I tucked the flyer into my purse, unsure but curious. The idea of starting anything felt daunting, but it also stirred that quiet resolve I'd been nurturing. My garden flourished the sunflowers now taller than me, their faces bright against the September sky. I'd spend mornings there, weeding and pruning, my hands dirty and my mind clear. One afternoon, as I planted a new row of tulip bulbs, I found myself humming a song Tom used to sing, an old folk tune about coming home. I stopped my trowel in hand and realized I was finding my way home, not to a place, but to myself. The woman who'd been Michael's mother, Tom's wife, was still there, but she was more now. Stronger. Braver. I hadn't heard from Michael or Sarah since the letter, and the silence was both a relief and a wound. I'd stopped expecting their calls, but I couldn't stop missing Lily and Grace. I kept their old drawings in a box under my bed, pulling them out sometimes to trace their crayon scribbles, a heart from Lily, a wobbly cat from Grace. I wondered what Michael told them about me, if he said I was too busy or too old to visit. The thought made my chest tighten, but I pushed it down. I couldn't control their story, but I could write my own. Then one crisp morning, I got a call from David, my financial advisor. He'd finalized the sale of the shares and wanted to meet. We sat at my kitchen table, the same one where Michael had told me to leave, and he spread out papers showing the new account's balance. It was more than I'd imagined, enough to keep the house to travel to start something new. "You've got security now," Julie David said, his voice kind but serious. "But you need to think about what you want. This is your life." I nodded, my fingers tracing the edge of a document. For so long, my life had been about others. Now it was mine to shape. That afternoon, I drove to the women's group Clara had mentioned. The meeting was in a small office downtown with folding chairs and a table of cookies and coffee. About a dozen women, most in their 60s and 70s, sat in a circle sharing ideas for projects, craft shops, tutoring programs, community gardens. I listened nervous, my hands clasped in my lap. When it was my turn, I almost passed, but Clara's voice echoed in my head. "I'm Julie," I said, my voice wobbling. "I teach a painting class, and I'd like to start an art program for women like us, a place where we can create and feel seen." The room was quiet for a moment, then a woman named Ruth with a sharp bob and a warm smile said, "That's beautiful, Julie. Count me in." Others nodded, and by the end, I had a small group willing to help. We started meeting weekly, planning the program. Ruth, who'd run a nonprofit years ago, helped me draft a budget. Another woman, Ellen, knew a local gallery owner who offered us space for exhibitions. I used a small portion of the stock money to buy supplies, canvases, paints, easels, feeling a thrill each time I signed a check. It wasn't about the money, it was about building something that mattered. We called it Silver Brushes, a nod to our age and our creativity. The first class was set for November, and though I was terrified, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. One evening, as I was locking up the community center after my regular painting class, I saw a familiar car in the parking lot. It was Michael's. My heart lurched, a mix of hope and dread. He stepped out, his face tired, his jacket rumpled. "Mom," he said, his voice softer than I remembered. "Can we talk?" I nodded, leading him inside to the empty classroom, my hands steady but my pulse racing. He sat across from me, looking smaller somehow, and started talking about his startup. "It was failing," he said. "Bills were piling up, investors were pulling out. He didn't mention the letter, but I knew why he was here. I heard you sold some stocks," he said, his eyes flicking to mine. "If you've got anything left, it could really help. For the girls, you know." Those words, "for the girls," hit me like a punch. He knew exactly how to pull at my heart, but this time I saw it for what it was. Manipulation, not love. I took a deep breath, my voice calm but firm. "Michael, I've given you everything I could. I don't have anything left for the business." It was a lie, the money was there, safe in my account, but it was my truth now. He stared at me, his jaw tight, then nodded. "Okay, Mom," he said, standing. "I'll figure it out." He left without a hug, without asking how I was. I sat there long after he was gone, the room dark except for the glow of a streetlight through the window. I thought about the years I'd spent trying to make him happy, trying to be enough. I thought about Lily and Grace and how I'd have given anything to see them. But I also thought about silver brushes, about the women who'd become my family, about the garden waiting for me at home. I wasn't Michael's bank or Sarah's babysitter. I was Julie, and I was enough. The next day, I went to the gallery where we'd hold our first Silver Brushes exhibition. Ruth and Ellen were there, hanging fairy lights and arranging easels. We laughed as we fumbled with the decorations, our hands stained with paint and hope. I painted a new piece for the show, a field of sunflowers under a stormy sky with a single figure standing tall. It was me, I realized, not as I'd been, but as I was becoming. I started wearing Tom's old watch again, the one he'd worn every day until he died. Its leather strap was worn, but its tick was steady like a heartbeat. It reminded me of his faith in me, of the life we'd built together. I wore it to the women's group, to my classes, to the garden, a small talisman of my strength. Each time I glanced at it, I felt him saying, "You've got this, Julie." Michael didn't call again, and I didn't expect him to. But I kept moving forward one step at a time, building a life that was mine. The fracture in me was still there, but it wasn't a weakness anymore. It was a space where light could get in. The air turned crisp as November arrived, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of change. I was 67, and for the first time in decades, I felt like I was living for myself. The money from the stock shares sat quietly in my account, a safety net I hadn't had since Tom was alive. I didn't touch it beyond what I'd spent on silver brushes, but knowing it was there gave me a steadiness I hadn't realized I'd lost. My days were full now, not with the frantic giving of my past, but with purpose, teaching, painting, planning the art program with Ruth and Ellen. Yet beneath it all, there was still a hollow space where Michael and the girls used to be. I didn't dwell on it, but it was there like a bruise that only hurt when pressed. Silver Brushes was coming together faster than I'd expected. We'd secured the gallery for our first exhibition, a small but bright space with white walls and tall windows. Ruth, with her knack for organization, had created flyers, and Ellen was charming local businesses into donating snacks for the opening night. I was painting more than ever, my spare room now a proper studio, with canvases leaning against every wall. My latest piece, the sunflower field with the lone figure, was finished, and when I showed it to Margaret, she squeezed my hand and said, "Julie, that's you. Stronger than you know." I smiled, but her words settled deep, like roots finding soil. Teaching the painting class at the community center was my joy. My students, women with gray hair and stories as rich as mine, brought me drawings and baked goods, small tokens of gratitude that warmed me more than I could say. One woman, Patricia, who'd lost her husband to cancer, painted a portrait of her old dog, her hands trembling as she added the final strokes. When she showed it to the class, we all clapped, and she beamed, her eyes bright with pride. I realized I wasn't just teaching them to paint. I was helping them reclaim pieces of themselves, just as they were helping me reclaim mine. Clara kept me grounded, her sharp humor a counterpoint to my quieter moments. One afternoon as we walked through the park, she stopped by a bench and said, "Julie, you're different now. You're not carrying their weight anymore." She meant Michael and Sarah, and she was right. I'd stopped waiting for their approval, their calls, their love, but I still carried the girls. I'd started writing letters to Lily and Grace, not to send, at least not yet, but to keep them close. In them, I told stories about their grandpa Tom, about the maple tree in my yard, about the woman I hoped they'd grow up to be. I sealed each one and tucked it into the box with their drawings, a quiet act of love I could still give. One morning, I decided to clean out the attic, something I'd avoided since Tom died. It was filled with boxes of his things, tools, books, a jacket he'd worn fishing. I found a small wooden box I'd forgotten about, One he'd carved himself with my initials etched on the lid. Inside was a locket he'd given me on our 10th anniversary, a simple silver oval with a photo of us inside. I slipped it around my neck, the weight familiar and comforting. Wearing it felt like carrying him with me, a reminder of the life we'd built and the strength he'd always seen in me. I wore it every day after that alongside his watch, my own quiet rebellion against being forgotten. The women's group was another lifeline. We met weekly, and I'd started helping other women with their projects, a knitting cooperative, a memoir writing class. I shared my plans for silver brushes, and their encouragement pushed me forward. One woman, Gloria, who'd started a tutoring program, pulled me aside after a meeting. "Julie," she said, her voice firm, "you're not just doing this for us. You're showing the world what we're worth." Her words echoed Margaret's Clara's, and I began to believe them. I wasn't just a mother or a widow. I was a creator, a teacher, a woman with something to give. I started looking at my house differently, too. It was still the one Tom and I had bought with its creaky floors and faded wallpaper, but now it felt like mine. I repainted the kitchen a soft yellow, hung my paintings on the walls, and bought a new armchair for the living room. Small changes, but they marked the space as my own. I stopped thinking of it as the house Michael wanted to take. It was my home, and I wasn't going anywhere. Then came a letter, not from Michael, but from Sarah. It was handwritten, which surprised me, and its tone was softer than I expected. She wrote that the girls missed me, that things had been hectic, that they hadn't meant to push me away. She invited me to Thanksgiving at their house, saying it would mean a lot to Lily and Grace. My heart leapt at the thought of seeing them, but something in me hesitated. The letter felt like an olive branch, but it also felt calculated, like they'd only reached out because Michael's visit hadn't worked. I set it on the kitchen table and left it there unanswered for days. I talked it over with Clara at our next coffee date. "What do you want, Julie?" she asked, cutting through my rambling. "Not what they want, not what the girls need. What do you want?" I didn't have an answer right away, but her question stayed with me. I wanted to see Lily and Grace, to braid their hair and hear their laughter, but I didn't want to go back to being their convenience, their afterthought. I wanted respect, not just love. I wrote back to Sarah a short note saying I'd think about Thanksgiving but was busy with my own plans. It was the truth, and it felt like a small victory. The Silver Brushes exhibition was a week away, and we were in a frenzy of preparation. I'd painted 2 more pieces, a quiet lake at dawn for Tom and a vibrant garden for me. Ruth had rallied the local paper to cover the event, and Ellen had convinced a caterer to donate wine and cheese. My students were contributing their own work, and I could see their pride growing with each class. Patricia's dog portrait was framed, and she'd written a small plaque dedicating it to her husband. I helped her hang it in the gallery, my heart swelling with something like motherhood but freer. The day before the exhibition, I got a call from David, my financial advisor. He'd been monitoring Michael's startup at my request to see how my decision to sell the shares had impacted them. "It's not good, Julie," he said. "They're in debt, and without your investment, they're struggling to find new funding." I waited for guilt to hit, but it didn't. Instead, I felt a strange calm. Michael had chosen to treat me as dispensable, and now he was facing the consequences. I thanked David and asked him to keep me updated, but I didn't offer to help. That door was closed. That night, I walked to the backyard and sat under the maple tree, the locket cool against my chest. The tulip bulbs I'd planted were sleeping beneath the soil, waiting for spring. I thought about Michael, about the boy he'd been, and the man he'd become. I thought about Sarah, who'd never seen me as more than a means to an end. And I thought about Lily and Grace, who I loved with every fiber of my being. I didn't know if I'd go to Thanksgiving, but I knew I wouldn't go as the woman I'd been, apologetic, eager to please. I was Julie now, and I was enough. The exhibition was the next evening, and as I stood in the gallery watching strangers and friends admire our work, I felt a pride I hadn't known was possible. My sunflower painting sold within an hour, and when Ruth handed me the check, I laughed, tears in my eyes. It wasn't about the money, it was about being seen, valued, whole. I wore Tom's watch and the locket, my red scarf bright against my black dress, and when Margaret pulled me into a hug, she whispered, "You did this, Julie. You." I looked around at the women I'd taught, the friends I'd made, the life I'd built, and I knew she was right. I was planting my own garden now, and it was blooming. The glow of the Silver Brushes exhibition lingered in me like the warmth of a fire on a cold night. I was 67, and for the first time I felt like I was standing in my own light, not someone else's. The gallery had been alive with laughter, clinking glasses, and the soft hum of admiration for our paintings. My students' women, who'd once doubted their own hands, stood tall beside their work, their faces radiant with pride. Patricia's dog portrait drew a crowd, and when she told a stranger it was for her late husband, I saw tears in their eyes. I sold 2 more pieces that night, including the lake at dawn I'd painted for Tom, and though it hurt to let it go, it felt right, like sending a piece of him into the world. The money went into a fund for Silver Brushes to keep it growing, to give more women a chance to be seen. I wore Tom's locket and watch every day now there wait a quiet reminder of the life I'd lived and the one I was building. The red scarf I'd bought became my signature, a splash of color that made me feel bold. Clara teased me about it, saying I look like an artist now, not just a teacher. "You're claiming your space, Julie," she said one afternoon over tea, her eyes sharp with approval. I smiled, but her words sank deep. I was claiming my space not just in the gallery or the community center, but in my own heart. Thanksgiving was approaching, and Sarah's letter still sat on my kitchen table, its edges curling from being handled so often. I hadn't decided whether to go. Part of me ached to see Lily and Grace, to hold them close and hear their giggles. But another part, the part that had grown stronger these past months, knew I couldn't go back to being their convenience. I wanted to be their Nana, not their babysitter, and that meant setting boundaries, even if it hurt. I wrote another letter to the girls telling them about the exhibition, about the sunflowers in my garden, about how much I loved them. I sealed it and added it to the box under my bed, wondering if I'd ever find the courage to send them. My garden was quieter now, the sunflowers drooping as winter loomed, but the tulip bulbs I'd planted held a promise of spring. I spent mornings there, wrapped in a shawl, sipping coffee and sketching ideas for new paintings. One was a portrait of the maple tree, its branches bare but strong, a symbol of endurance. I started it in my studio, the spare room now cluttered with canvases and paint tubes, and each stroke felt like a conversation with Tom. "I'm doing it," I whispered to him one night, my brush poised over the canvas. "I'm living." I imagined his smile, the one that crinkled his eyes and kept painting. Silver Brushes was growing. We'd started a second class, and I was training Ruth to teach it, her steady hands perfect for guiding nervous beginners. Ellen had secured a grant from a local arts council enough to cover supplies for a year. We were planning a spring showcase bigger than the first, with live music and a poetry reading. I was nervous but excited, my mind buzzing with ideas. The women's group cheered us on, and I started mentoring a few members on their own projects, a cookbook of family recipes, a walking club for seniors. I was learning to lead, not just follow, and it felt like stretching muscles I'd forgotten I had. One chilly afternoon, I got a call from David, my financial advisor. He sounded hesitant, which wasn't like him. "Julie, I've got news about Michael's startup," he said. "They're in serious trouble. They've missed loan payments, and there's talk of bankruptcy." He paused, waiting for my reaction. I stood in my kitchen, the phone pressed to my ear, and felt a pang, not guilt, but sadness. Sadness for the boy. Michael had been the one who'd clung to me after Tom died, who'd promised to make me proud. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man who'd chosen to see me as a means to an end. "Thank you, David," I said, my voice steady. "Let me know if anything changes." I hung up, and for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to fix it. Michael's choices were his own. That evening, I went to Clara's for dinner. She'd invited Margaret and a few others from the book club, and we crowded around her small dining table, eating lasagna and arguing about our latest read. The room was warm, filled with laughter and the clink of wine glasses. I looked around at these women, my friends, my family, and felt a gratitude so deep it brought tears to my eyes. Clara caught my gaze and raised her glass. To Julie, she said, for reminding us what we're capable of. The others toasted, and I blinked back tears, my heart full. I wasn't lonely anymore. I was home. The next day, I made a decision about Thanksgiving. I wrote to Sarah a short note saying I wouldn't come but would love to see the girls another time on my terms. I suggested a day at my house where we could bake cookies and paint like we used to. I didn't know if she'd agree, but it felt right to set the terms to choose myself as much as I chose them. I mailed the letter and let it go, trusting that whatever happened, I'd be okay. Then came a surprise. Ruth called me one morning, her voice bubbling with excitement. The local paper wanted to do a feature on silver brushes focusing on me as the founder. They're calling you a quiet force in the community, she said, laughing. I was stunned, a mix of pride and nerves swirling in my chest. We met with the reporter, a young woman with kind eyes, at the gallery. I told her about the program, about the women who'd found their voices through paint, about the joy of creating something new at our age. When she asked why I started it, I hesitated, then said I wanted to remind myself and others that we're still here, still valuable no matter what anyone says. She nodded, scribbling in her notebook, and I felt a weight lift. I was telling my truth, and it was enough. The article came out a week later with a photo of me standing by my sunflower painting, Tom's locket visible at my throat. Friends from the women's group clipped it out, and my students brought me copies, their faces beaming. I framed one and hung it in my studio, not out of vanity, but as a reminder of what I'd built. I was no longer just Michael's mother or Tom's widow. I was Julie, and I was making my mark. One evening, as I was locking up the community center after class, I saw a familiar figure by my car. It was Sarah. My heart stuttered, but I walked toward her, my chin high. She looked tired, her hair pulled back, her eyes uncertain. "Julie," she said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "Can we talk?" I nodded, leading her to a bench nearby. She sat twisting her hands and started talking about Michael's startup, how it was crumbling, how they were drowning in debt. "We didn't realize how much we relied on you," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry, Julie, for everything." I listened, my face calm, but inside I was reeling. Sorry was a word I hadn't expected, but it didn't erase the years of dismissal. The birthday, I wasn't invited to the house they'd tried to take. "I hear you, Sarah," I said, my voice steady. "But apologies don't undo what's done. I've built a life now, and I'm not going back to being your safety net." She looked at me, her eyes wide, and I saw something new, respect maybe, or fear. She nodded, standing. "Can the girls see you soon?" she asked. "They miss you." I thought of the letters under my bed, the box of their drawings. "Yes," I said. "But it'll be on my terms, at my house, when I'm ready." She agreed, and as she walked away, I felt a shift. I wasn't begging for their love anymore. I was choosing it. That night, I painted until dawn, a new canvas, a woman standing under a starry sky, her face turned upward, unafraid. It was me I knew, and it was every woman I'd met who'd refused to fade. I wore Tom's watch, the locket, my red scarf, and I painted with a fire I hadn't known I had. I was Julie, and I was blooming. Winter settled over the town like a soft blanket, dusting the rooftops with snow and turning my garden into a quiet sleeping world. I was 67, and the life I'd been building felt like a house I'd constructed brick by brick, sturdy, warm mine. Silver Brushes was thriving with 2 classes running and a waiting list for the spring showcase. The women's group had become a second home where I laughed and planned and mentored others, my voice no longer trembling when I spoke. I wore Tom's locket and watched every day their familiar weight grounding me, and my red scarf was a bright thread woven through my days. But even in this new strength, There were moments when the ache for Lily and Grace caught me off guard, a sharp tug at my heart that reminded me love doesn't vanish even when you set it free. Sarah's visit had left me unsettled, not because of her apology, but because of what it revealed. They were desperate, she'd said, drowning in debt from Michael's failing startup. Her words stirred a mix of emotions, pity, anger, and a fierce protectiveness over the life I'd reclaimed. I'd meant what I said. I wasn't their safety net anymore. But the girls were another matter. I wanted them in my life not as a duty, but as a joy, and I was determined to make that happen on my terms. I wrote another letter to them describing the snow in my backyard, the way it sparkled under the moonlight, and how I'd saved a spot for them to paint with me. I didn't seal this one. I left it on my desk, a small act of hope. Silver brushes kept me busy. Ruth was now teaching the second class, her calm presence a perfect complement to my passion. Ellen had turned our spring showcase into a community event with a local band and a kids' art corner. My students were painting with confidence, their canvases filled with bold colors and stories. Diane's abstract of her childhood farm, Patricia's vibrant sunset for her daughter. I was painting, too, the woman under the starry sky, now joined by others, a garden in bloom, a lighthouse against a stormy sea. Each one felt like a piece of me, a way of saying I'm still here. Clara and Margaret were my constants, their friendship a lifeline. One snowy evening, we sat in Clara's living room, a fire crackling as we sipped hot cocoa. Margaret pulled out the newspaper article about silver brushes now creased from being passed around. "You're a local celebrity, Julie," she teased, but her eyes were soft with pride. I laughed, brushing it off, but their belief in me was a mirror showing me a woman I was still getting to know, strong, capable, whole. We talked late into the night about books and dreams and the families who'd let us down. "You're not waiting for them anymore," Clara said, her voice firm. "You're living." I knotted my throat tight, knowing she was right. I started making changes at home, small but deliberate. I cleared out the guest room, turning it into a space for Lily and Grace to visit with bunk beds and a shelf for their books. I hung one of their old drawings on the wall, a wobbly heart from Lily, and placed a small easel in the corner. It wasn't about expecting them to come, it was about being ready if they did. I repainted the living room, a warm ivory hung my starry sky painting above the fireplace, and bought a new rug, soft under my feet. The house felt alive again, not just a relic of Tom's in my past, but a home for the woman I was now. One morning, I drove to the community center and found a package waiting for me. It was from Helen, the student who'd painted the rose, and cried. Inside was a knitted shawl, deep blue with silver threads, and a note for Julie, who helped me find my colors again. I wrapped it around my shoulders, the wool soft and warm, and wore it to class that day. My students noticed their smiles wide, and I realized how much we'd become a family, bound not by blood, but by shared courage. I was their teacher, but they were teaching me too about resilience, about joy, about the power of starting over. Then came a call from David, my financial advisor, his voice clipped with urgency. "Julie Michaels' startup is done," he said. "They've filed for bankruptcy. There's a chance they'll lose the house." My stomach twisted, not for Michael or Sarah, but for Lily and Grace. I thought of their little faces, their bedroom with its pink curtains and stuffed animals. "Is there anything I can do without bailing them out?" I asked. David paused, then suggested setting up a trust for the girls, something to protect their future education, maybe a home someday without giving Michael access. "It's a way to help them, not him," he said. I told him to start the paperwork, my heart racing with the rightness of it. I'd love the girls my way, not Michael's. The trust took weeks to set up, and I used a portion of the stock money to fund it, keeping it separate from my own savings. I didn't tell Sarah or Michael, not yet. It was for the girls, not for their approval. When David sent the final documents, I signed them at my kitchen table. Tom's watch, ticking softly on my wrist. I felt a quiet power like planting those tulip bulbs months ago, knowing they'd bloom long after I was gone. I wrote another letter to the girls telling them about the trust, about how their Nana wanted them to have choices to be strong. I sealed it and added it to the box, my love for them safe in ink and paper. The spring showcase was a month away, and we were in a whirlwind of preparation. I painted a new piece for it, a woman holding a lantern, her face calm against a dark sky. It was me, I knew, but it was also every woman in silver brushes, every friend who'd lifted me up. Ruth and Ellen were relentless organizing volunteers and promoting the event. The local paper ran another story calling Silver Brushes a beacon for women redefining their later years. I blushed at the praise, but felt a swell of pride. We were doing something real, something lasting. One afternoon, as I was hanging flyers in town, I ran into Sarah's mother, Diane, at the coffee shop. Her face tightened when she saw me, but she forced a smile. "Julie, you're looking well," she said, her voice thin. I knotted my red scarf bright against my coat. "I'm doing well," I said, and meant it. She mentioned the girls, how they talked about me, and then hesitantly, Michael's troubles. "It's been hard," she said, her eyes searching mine for sympathy. I thought of the birthday. I wasn't invited to her pitying look that day. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, my voice calm but firm. But I've got my own life now. She blinked, surprised, and I walked away, my head high. I wasn't her lonely old woman anymore. That night, I sat under the maple tree, the shawl Helen gave me wrapped around my shoulders. The snow had melted and the ground was soft, ready for spring. I thought about Michael, about the bankruptcy, about the house they might lose. I thought about Sarah's apology, Diane's discomfort, and the girls who I loved more than my own breath. I didn't owe Michael or Sarah my forgiveness, but I could choose how to love Lily and Grace. I decided to invite them over after the showcase to paint and bake and be together, just us. I'd tell Sarah soon, but for now, it was enough to plan it to hold it close. I went inside and painted until midnight, the lantern woman glowing on the canvas. I wore Tom's locket, the shawl, my red scarf draped over a chair. The fracture in me was still there, but it was filled with light now, with the colors of my new life. I was Julie, and I was shining. The spring showcase for Silver Brushes arrived like a burst of color after a long winter, filling the gallery with light and life. I was 67, and as I stood among the canvases surrounded by my students and friends, I felt a pride so deep it seemed to root me to the earth. The room buzzed with voices, strangers admiring Patricia's sunset, locals clapping for Ruth's abstract waves, children tugging at their parents' hands to see the kids' art corner. My lantern woman painting hung in the center, her calm face glowing under the gallery lights, and every time someone paused to study it, I felt a quiet thrill. This was my world now, built from my hands and heart, and no one could take it away. I wore Tom's locket and watched the blue shawl from Helen draped over my shoulders, and my red scarf tied loosely around my neck. Clara and Margaret flanked me, their laughter a steady rhythm through the evening. "You've outdone yourself, Julie," Margaret said, her eyes sparkling as she gestured to the crowd. Clara, never one for sentiment, just squeezed my arm and said, "Told you you had it in you." Their belief in me was a lifeline, but I was starting to believe in myself, too. The local paper was there, again snapping photos, and when the reporter asked for a quote, I said, "This isn't just about art. It's about women like us saying we're still here, still creating, still mattering." She smiled, jotting it down, and I felt the weight of my own words settle into me. The showcase was a success. Every painting sold the grant money secured for another year, and a dozen new students signed up for classes. Ruth and Ellen were already planning a summer workshop, and I was mentoring 2 new teachers, women from the women's group, with their own stories of reclaiming their worth. I looked around at the faces, my students, my friends, the community we'd built, and realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. But beneath the joy, there was a current of anticipation. I'd invited Sarah to bring Lily and Grace to my house the next day, my first step toward seeing them again. I'd written to Sarah a week ago, suggesting a visit where we could paint and bake, just the three of us. She'd agreed, her reply brief but polite, and I'd spent days preparing cleaning the guest room with its bunk beds, buying cookie dough and kid-friendly paints, hanging their old heart drawing on the fridge. I didn't know what to expect, but I was ready to love them as Julie, not as the grandmother they'd pushed aside. The trust I'd set up for their future was my silent gift, a way to protect them without saving Michael and Sarah from their own choices. The morning after the showcase, I was in my kitchen kneading dough for the cookies when the doorbell rang. My heart leapt and I wiped my hands on my apron, smoothing my red scarf before opening the door. There they were, Lily and Grace, their eyes wide, their small hands clutching Sarah's. Nana Grace shouted, launching herself at me, and Lily followed her hug quieter but just as fierce. I knelt, wrapping them in my arms, their warmth filling the hollow space I'd carried for months. Sarah stood back, her face strained but soft. "They've missed you," she said, her voice low. I nodded, standing, and invited them in. The girls ran to the guest room, squealing at the bunk beds and the easel. I gave them smocks and let them paint their small hands, smearing colors across paper blue stars from Grace, a wobbly flower from Lily. We baked cookies, their laughter echoing as flour dusted their cheeks. Sarah watched quiet, her eyes flickering with something like regret. I didn't push her to talk. This day was for the girls, not for her apologies or Michael's debts. When they left, Lily hugged me and whispered, "Can we come back, Nana?" I kissed her forehead, my throat tight. "Any time, sweetheart," I said. Sarah met my gaze, nodding slightly, and I knew we'd reached an understanding. The girls were ours to share, but I was no longer theirs to use. That evening I sat under the maple tree, the air cool and the tulip bulbs stirring beneath the soil. I thought about the girls, their paintings now taped to my fridge, and felt a peace I hadn't known was possible. But peace is fragile, and the next day it was tested. David called with news that shook me. Michael and Sarah had lost their house. The bankruptcy had caught up, and they were moving in with Sarah's parents, their lives unraveling. I waited for guilt to flood me, but it didn't. Instead, I felt a clarity sharp and unyielding. They'd chosen to dismiss me, to take without giving, and now they were facing the consequences. The trust for the girls was in place, ensuring their future, but Michael and Sarah would have to find their own way. I didn't expect what came next. A week after the showcase, I was at the community center packing up after class when Michael showed up. He looked older, his shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow. "Mom," he said, his voice raw, "I need to talk." I led him inside, my heart steady but wary. We sat in the empty classroom, the walls lined with my students' paintings, and he started talking. The startup was gone. The house was gone. And he was sorry for everything. "I didn't realize how much we needed you," he said, his voice breaking. "Not just the money, but you." He mentioned the stock shares, how he'd assumed I'd always be there to save him, how he'd been wrong. I listened. My hands folded Tom's watch, ticking softly. His words were heavy, but they didn't soften the truth. "Michael," I said, my voice calm but firm, "I gave you everything, my time, my money, my heart. And you told me to leave my own home. You made me feel like nothing." He flinched, his eyes dropping to the floor. "I know," he whispered. "I was wrong." I nodded, letting the silence stretch. Then I said, "I've built a life now, Michael. I'm not your bank or your babysitter. I'm your mother, and I deserve respect." He looked at me, really looked, and I saw something shift, shock maybe, or recognition. I didn't tell him about the trust for the girls, not yet. That was for them, not for his redemption. But I did tell him about silver brushes, about the women I'd helped, the paintings I'd sold, the life I'd made. "I'm not a lonely old woman," I said, my voice steady. "I never was." He nodded, tears in his eyes, and when he left, he hugged me, a real hug, not the perfunctory ones of the past. I didn't forgive him, not fully, but I felt a weight lift. I'd spoken my truth, and it was enough. The revelation spread quietly. Sarah's mother, Diane, called me a few days later, her voice hesitant. She'd heard about Michael's visit, about my words about silver brushes. "I didn't know Julie," she said. "I didn't see you." I let her words hang, then said, "I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." She was silent, and when she hung up, I knew she'd carry that with her. The community knew, too. The paper ran a follow-up story mentioning my role in silver brushes and hinting at my family's struggles, though I hadn't shared details. People stopped me in town, offering kind words, and I felt their respect, not their pity. I stood taller after that. I wore my red scarf, Tom's locket, the shawl from Helen, and I walked through my days with a quiet dignity. Michael and Sarah were rebuilding, but I didn't offer to help. I saw the girls regularly now, their visits filled with paint and cookies and stories under the maple tree. I gave them the box of letters one day, watching their eyes light up as they read my words. "Nana, you wrote these for us," Lily asked, and I nodded, my heart full. They didn't need to know about the trust yet, but they knew I loved them, and that was enough. I was Julie, and I had spoken. My dignity, my life, my worth, they were mine, and no one could silence them again. The spring sun warmed the earth, coaxing the tulip bulbs I'd planted months ago into vibrant blooms, reds, yellows, and pinks, bursting from the soil like a promise kept. I was 67, and as I walked through my garden, the morning dew brushing my ankles, I felt a peace that had once seemed impossible. Silver Brushes was now a cornerstone of the community, with classes booked through the summer, and a third teacher, Diane, joining Ruth and me. The women's group had grown too, with new projects sprouting like my tulips, a literacy program, a quilt-making circle. I mentored where I could, but mostly I marveled at the strength of the women around me, each one a testament to what we could do when we refused to fade. I wore Tom's locket and watched Helen's blue shawl and my red scarf, their colors, a quiet declaration of the woman I'd become. Lily and Grace were a regular part of my life now, their visits a melody that brightened my days. They'd come over every other Saturday, their small hands sticky with cookie dough or smeared with paint, as we created in the guest room I'd made for them. I taught them to mix colors, to plant seeds in the garden, to tell stories under the maple tree. Lily, now 6, would sit cross-legged, her serious eyes fixed on me as I told her about her grandpa Tom, how he'd carved the wooden box that held my locket. Grace, 4 and full of giggles, would interrupt with questions, her curls bouncing. I gave them the freedom to be children, not pawns in their parents' struggles, and their love was a gift I cherished without strings. Michael and Sarah were rebuilding slowly in a small apartment near Sarah's parents. I saw them occasionally, mostly when they dropped off or picked up the girls. Michael's apologies had softened his edges, but I kept my distance, offering kindness, but not my trust. Sarah was quieter now, her old sharpness dulled by their losses. She thanked me for the time with the girls, and once she brought me a photo of them painting at my house, framed as a gesture of peace. I hung it in the kitchen next to their heart drawing, but I didn't let it pull me back into their orbit. I'd learned to love them without losing myself. The trust I'd set up for Lily and Grace was my silent vow to them, a safety net for their education, their dreams tucked away until they were older. I hadn't told Michael or Sarah, and I didn't plan to. It was for the girls, not for their gratitude or approval. Sometimes I'd sit at my kitchen table, Tom's watch ticking softly, and imagine them opening the trust years from now, knowing their Nana had believed in them. The thought brought a smile, a quiet joy that needed no audience. Silver Brushes had changed me as much as I'd changed it. My paintings hung in homes across town, and I'd started a new series, Women in Motion, dancing, planting, dreaming their faces alive with purpose. The lantern woman, the sunflower field, the starry sky, they were part of me. But so were these new figures, bold and unapologetic. I sold enough to fund a scholarship for older women in the arts named for Tom, a way to honor his belief in me. The community center gave me a small office where I planned classes and met with students, my days full of laughter and paint-stained aprons. Clara and Margaret were there through it all, their friendship a steady current. And when we toasted to the program's one-year anniversary, I realized I'd built a family, not of blood, but of heart. One afternoon, I got a letter from Sarah's mother, Diane. It was unexpected, her handwriting shaky on the envelope. She wrote about the articles on silver brushes, about hearing Michael and Sarah talk of my strength, about her own regret for how she'd seen me. "I was wrong, Julie," she wrote. "You're not who I thought. I'm sorry." I read it twice, then set it aside. I didn't need her apology, but it was a reminder of how far I'd come. I wrote back, brief but kind, saying I wished her well, but was focused on my own path. I mailed it and let it go, the weight of her pity no longer mine to carry. The town had changed too. People greeted me by name at the grocery store, asked about the next showcase, thanked me for inspiring their mothers or aunts. The local college invited me to speak at a women's history event, and though I was nervous, I stood at the podium, my red scarf bright, and told my story, not the details of Michael's betrayal, but the truth of rebuilding at 67, of finding worth when others tried to erase it. The applause was warm, but it was the women who approached me after sharing their own stories of being dismissed that stayed with me. I listened, my heart open, and knew I was part of something bigger than myself. One evening, as summer approached, I decided to do something I'd been thinking about for months. I took the wooden box Tom had carved, the one with my initials, and filled it with small treasures. A photo of us, a pressed tulip from the garden, a note I'd written to Lily and Grace about their strength. I drove to the lake where Tom and I used to picnic, the place we'd dreamed of growing old together. I sat by the water, the box in my lap, and whispered to him, "We did it, Tom. I'm okay." Then I buried the box near a willow tree, a quiet ritual to honor our past and my present. It wasn't about letting go. It was about carrying him forward in a new way. I kept painting, teaching gardening, living. My house was alive with color, my starry sky painting above the fireplace, the girls' artwork on the fridge tulips, in vases on every table. I hosted dinners for Clara, Margaret, Ruth, and Ellen, our laughter spilling into the night. I saw Lily and Grace, their visits, a rhythm I could count on, and I loved them fiercely without fear of losing myself. Michael and Sarah were part of their lives, not mine, and I was at peace with that. I didn't forgive them fully, their words. Their dismissal had cut too deep, but I didn't need to. I'd forgiven myself for believing I was less than I was. One quiet morning, I walked to the garden and lit a small candle, placing it among the tulips. It flickered in the breeze, a soft glow against the dawn. I thought of the woman I'd been, the one who'd stood in this yard a year ago, broken by Michael's words. And I thought of the woman I was now, strong, whole, unafraid. I'd sold the stock shares, let Michael and Sarah face their debts, and built a life that was mine. I'd proven my worth not to them, but to myself, and that was the greatest victory. As the candle burned, I whispered a truth I'd learned, one I wanted to share with every woman watching, every heart that had been told. It was too old, too small, too broken. Your worth isn't measured by who accepts you, but by how you choose to honor yourself. I blew out the candle, its smoke curling toward the sky, and walked back to my house, ready for whatever came next. I was Julie, and I was home.